following is a Goulash Media production. goulashmedia.net.
Welcome to the System is Down.
What's up, Downers? Happy July 4th in this, the year of our Lord, 2017. I'm a day late and $1 short on releasing this episode, so thank you so much for your patience and for coming back for some more uncomfortable discussions. On today's episode, I had the pleasure of chatting with TSID Forum member and also Lions of Liberty Forum member Trey Weaver about everything from libertarianism to conspiracies and even a little bit of religion. Trey hosts his own podcast called Subversion, where he interviews musicians about life, death, and art. It's a fantastic show, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes at tsidpod.com, so be sure to check that out. But as much as I personally love music, it's just not an uncomfortable enough topic for this show, and uncomfortable is what we're here to do. So with that said, don't sit back, don't relax, and let's get weird. My guest today is Trey Weaver. He is the creator of the Subversion podcast. He is an anarcho-capitalist leaning libertarian, a big music enthusiast, a former conspiracy theorist turned skeptic, a fellow podcaster, and a member of the TSID forum. So as you can see, he and I have a lot of similarities and one glaringly obvious difference. So, Trey, how's it going?
Yo,
man?
How you doing, Dan?
Pretty good. Hey, yeah, just tell me a little bit about yourself. Give me kind of your background. There's a lot of stuff to dig into here, for sure, and a lot of stuff that I know very little about and would be happy to learn from you on these things, especially the political stuff.
Yeah, so as some of your listeners may know who came from Lions of Liberty, I was on Lions of Liberty on Felony Friday with John Odermatt. Yep. And kind of detailed my experience with criminal justice in Iowa, which is my my hometown where I grew up. It's a town called Clear Lake. Yeah, I just had some pretty bad experiences with law enforcement there. I'm sure Dan could link you to the show notes where you can find that episode and get more in detail on that.
Absolutely.
Essentially, I was a stoner kid in Iowa, so. So the law and the culture wasn't really on my side there. The Midwest is a very odd place politically and culturally. If I had to describe it, I would say that it is on the partisan end of things, it's the worst of both sides of the political extremes. Sure. Being very socially conservative and very economically left. So I don't want to be too dramatic, but because I'm making it sound like it's Nazi Germany, but it actually is a really beautiful place with beautiful people. I just really don't like the politics there.
It's not that beautiful. I'm in Illinois. Don't lie.
Right.
It's pretty flat and boring.
Yeah. You're in the Quad Cities, right? Which is that's kind of like the border of Iowa and Illinois, if I remember right.
Right, yeah. Right? I'm about a half hour south of the Quad Cities, so Alito, Illinois, tiny little podunk town of about 3,500. Okay. So if you want to talk about, like, stifling conservatism, come on down.
For sure. So, and as Dan was saying there, I described to him that I'm a former conspiracy theorist, but the more I think about it, the more I think that might be a bad description for me to give myself, because I'm sure there are some things that I would talk about that are kind of on the kooky side that normal, the normies would say that I'm probably a kook because I want to end the Federal Reserve. I have a high level of skepticism for any actions within the public sector. So in some ways, I am an anti-state conspiracy theorist in some way, because I do think that in the public sector, that is just one big conspiracy theory. So maybe I'm kind of just walking back my previously stated stance to you. But sure. I guess more or less what I was trying to say in one sentence was that I favor the scientific method over more or less instincts of emotion, which I feel like a lot of conspiracy theories sort of center around.
Definitely.
So there's a sort of religious aspect to conspiracy theories, in my opinion, which this isn't necessarily an indictment of any particular one. It's just like this phenomenon. And I always describe it to people as the root of the word culture starts with cult, right?
Right.
So if we were to consider that a cult in our language that we use is usually, in reference to a negative cult or a destructive cult, right? But from the Latin terminology, cult is just a cultural consensus, more or less,
right,
for lack of a better term. So I always just tell people that you just should choose your cults wisely. And I have chosen a cult of libertarianism where I favor property rights and non-aggression, and I have a high threshold for what violence can be used for, to either settle disputes over property rights claims or just, I don't feel like there is a legitimate use of violence for emotional reasons, even though that's hard to separate. If we look at Ludwig von Mises and his theory of human action, he breaks it down to this like dismal science of like how people interact with each other. And I know that the world isn't that simple, but basically, I'm of the opinion that we should always keep our emotions in check when we're considering things like justice, for example, because it's really easy for people to jump into, for example, when someone commits a heinous crime, we're not very shy about calling for the death penalty. I mean, you'll see this in comment sections on the internet all the time. Like someone commits a heinous crime and there are people being like, oh, cut his head off, blah, blah, blah. And, we're supposed to be the morally righteous West who doesn't cut people's heads off while demonizing ISIS. I just find it to be a little bit of a double standard.
You hear that, Kathy Griffin? You hear that?
Indeed. Basically, this is a big roundabout way of me saying that my roots in libertarianism really do kind of center around conspiracy theories. The person who introduced me to libertarianism, he was my sister's boyfriend at the time. And I remember he kind of like red pilled me, so to speak. And in part of that, he sort of introduced me to some pretty crazy theories that I wasn't on board with at the time. But I think the biggest thing about it was he broke my faith in leftism just in general, because I was reading like Kropotkin, I think is how you pronounce his name. He was a big like anarcho-communist, and I had such aversion to authority that I was looking for anything with the word anarchism in it, because I just thought that was, obviously authority is a problem, is what I thought. And I thought that I knew what political ideology I liked and agreed with, but then he introduced me to just the concept of capitalism in itself and how it is a system of voluntary interactions wherein people are able to distribute goods to each other in a nonviolent way. And he had introduced me to, and I think public schools kind of failed me in that I never heard the words or the names Mao or Stalin in high school or anything. Right. I only ever heard Hitler. So I thought that de facto right-wing governments in history have just been terrible, genocidal, and terrible. But then he just introduced me to, hey, your style of governance is really, really terrible too. So maybe you should just, take a step back and look at this whole free market thing. Well,
real quick,
go ahead.
Not to cut you off, but we both, we actually met each other because of the Lines of Liberty podcast, and I'm certainly no Mark Clare by any stretch. I am all about libertarianism and all that stuff, but my ability to retain what I hear and regurgitate it is very poor. So I actually know for a fact that, we haven't really dug into politics all that much at all on this podcast so far. So curious if you could give just a little bit of a breakdown. I know a lot of our listeners don't care about politics, and really libertarianism is what sparked my interest. Could you give a little bit of a breakdown on the ideas of libertarianism and the ideas of anarcho-capitalism and that type of thing?
Sure, no problem. So essentially, I think when I came to libertarianism, I had this really cloudy view of what it was. I thought it was just kind of like radical centrism.
Right.
And that's not how it works at all. So, and I'm sure if people were to pick up on it, I mentioned property rights and non-aggression, which are really the core ideas which govern the philosophy that we call libertarianism, and it falls under many blankets. I think what you could consider the origins of libertarianism would be classical liberalism and the likes of like John Locke, whereas previously governance was always a system of monarchies controlled by certain families and clandestine ownership of capital and land. So, and I feel like a lot of people, not to get too far ahead of myself, but a lot of people will call anarcho-capitalism neo-feudalism, which is sort of a mischaracterization and a straw man of what anarcho-capitalism is, because feudalism was a system of monarchy wherein, essentially, like I was saying, clandestine control of property, whereas in a system like we have now, I'm not sure, I think you're a listener to the Jason Stapleton program.
Absolutely.
He recently cited some statistics where in a market system, when you have wealth go down through generations, it doesn't last very long. Like 70% of wealth is gone by the second generation, and 80 or 90% of it is gone by the third. So in a market system, you actually still have to produce things of value in order to maintain a sort of clout and control and power. So I would just argue to people who, because I know some of your listeners are going to be leftists, I would imagine, and I would just say, that's a common argument that I hear against it.
I think I've got quite a few on both. I don't think there's a whole lot where I'm from. There's not a whole lot of people who even know what libertarianism is, in my opinion.
Okay.
In the bigger cities, there's a little bit more leftist, and here in small town, there's a whole bunch of right. So
sure, I hear you. And I think I'm getting too far in the weeds here, but anyway, just to get right down to it, it really does come down to the best system of property rights claims. Now, the flaw of leftism is that they totally reject property in and of itself, which is problematic because no one can determine who has the best claim to use a given resource.
Right.
Let's avoid the word capitalism because it has such a negative connotation attached to it.
Yeah.
Let's just focus on the concept of free exchange of goods. Given that we have high respect for property rights in libertarian circles, we very much favor the rights of the individual. And that's sort of one of the core tenets of libertarianism is the sovereignty of individuals. And what I mean by that is being as we own our bodies, right? A person named Stephan Kinsella often brings it back to this point, which we don't actually own ourselves, we own our bodies, which is just to clarify the legal aspect of self-ownership. Because if we're going to take self-ownership to its furthest logical conclusions without saying that you own your body specifically, you could come to basically make a legal argument that you own the labor that you produce and the intellectual property that you produce. And you cannot, in my opinion, intellectual property is illegitimate property, and you cannot own ideas. Because if basically intellectual property systems, and I know this is one of the golden calves. Besides public schooling, intellectual property is one of those things that you just can't go after. It is the golden calf that you can't attack. But essentially, what intellectual property law says is that you cannot use your resources in a specific way, and it's very arbitrary. I know that in a system of courts, they kind of break it down to what's reasonable. I understand that. But essentially, it does come down to someone else having control over somebody's use of resources. So yeah, kind of just to bring it back, libertarianism is about property rights. It's not about being a little conservative and a little liberal.
Fiscally conservative and socially liberal.
Yeah. Hey, when did Gary Johnson get here? See, and this is my big problem with the libertarian movement is oftentimes you say that you're a libertarian and people will start to attack the Libertarian Party. I think anybody who's really familiar with libertarianism knows that there's a big gulf between the two. And I feel like they do not very well represent my ideas as a libertarian. And I'm even someone that, I often tell people on the internet that I've got no beefs with a classical liberal as far away on the political spectrum as we may be. I feel like they are a coalition of freedom for me. And I'm willing to work with people who aren't as radical as me. I'm totally fine with that. But it's when you completely waste resources and, misrepresent the philosophy that I get really upset, which is what Gary Johnson did.
Absolutely.
So Gary Johnson, you just said it. He said, "Oh, we're just fiscally conservative, socially liberal people and blah, blah, blah." And I went and actually saw him because for all of the trash that I'm going to throw at him, and I'm going to trash him.
Yep.
I do kind of respect him, and I favor his policy decisions over Trump or Hillary's any day. Absolutely. No, hands down.
Not a hard sell there.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think Judd Weiss really hit it on the head when he was on with Mark Claire, when he said that the presidential run should be about spreading ideas and not about winning an election, because you can't. I mean, let's just be honest. We'd like to. And dissenters from outside of the libertarian circles will say, well, you guys just need to stop being so ideological and start making some compromises. Well, if we're going to do that, then why don't we just be the Republican Party light? Because that's
if you're
turning
making
into
compromises, what's the point in being a political party at all?
Correct.
Like, we're not just a mismatch of people who don't like Republicans and don't like Democrats. We are a different idea completely. It's not, like you were saying, it's not just the middle of the road. And like Gary Johnson preached so heavily, we're not just an 8-lane highway straight up the middle. It's something completely different than that.
Right. And Murray Rothbard said once that, you have to be radical. I mean, you can't be afraid of it and turn moderate because, you just turn into the people that you're trying to take power from. So in trying to become this political force to compete with government, we have just been sort of co-opted by people that think the best thing to do is make government more efficient, which it's just basically not how it's supposed to work for us. We're supposed to be for limiting the power of the state. If we're going to get right down to it, I've made the case that property rights is the center piece of libertarianism. It doesn't have to do with left or right dichotomy. It has to do with the other end of the political compass. If you are to break it down into 4 quadrants, we are down in the bottom right usually as American libertarians, right? Because we are economically to the right and socially down towards libertarianism. So basically, we assert that individuals have rights to property, and that people cannot use violence against you unless you violate their property rights. Right. Pretty simple enough, right? And that's really what it boils down to.
You own yourself and your stuff, and you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone.
Right. And I am completely open to nuance. I'm not, like you were saying, I am leaning anarcho-capitalist. That doesn't mean that I'm completely dogmatic, and that, there probably is a point where people own so many resources that they are literally alienating other people.
Right.
I just find that scenario that people always come up with, I haven't ever seen happen other than in monarchies. So it's not even the system that I favor that they're trying to build a straw man against. So if we understand the nature of property rights, which I don't know if I really want to get too far into it because I'm not very familiar with John Locke. I know that he is the godfather of natural law. I
guarantee you, you're already going way above and beyond what most people have heard here on this podcast.
Okay.
Myself included. So
cool. Well, I'm glad this will be a teaching experience.
Absolutely.
So if we're to think about it, that is libertarianism, and what is the state? If I were to ask you, Dan, what do you say the state is?
It is an oppressive force.
It's that
that takes our stuff.
It's that, and a lot of these idioms and phrases that I'm coming up with, just to be clear, are not original to me. A lot of them are regurgitated from the likes of brilliant people like Ludwig von Mises, who I mentioned earlier, Murray Rothbard.
If their names are hard to pronounce, they're probably names that you can trust.
Yeah, that's a good route to take. Essentially, it is the social apparatus of violence, and we have monopolized that. so that we can have an easier venue for courts and for law enforcement. And it sounds completely logical, right? Until you look at the record of history and see that no government has ever remained very small. In the case of the American government in itself, I think it was the smallest successful government that ever existed. And I suppose I would argue that the Founding Fathers weren't actually libertarian because they did not treat all men equal. I mean, those are really great talking points for the right, and well, not just for the right. The left especially likes to use the progressive sounding lines from like Jefferson.
Hey, the Libertarian Party too.
Yeah.
And Austin Peterson quoted Jefferson all over the place.
And that's great. He says some great things, but these people still traded humans as capital. So in my opinion, and maybe this is the former leftist in me coming out, but that is kind of the one of the things that really got me concrete into libertarianism is this concept of self-ownership. So since the state is the social apparatus for violence, and if you bring up to people, this will really piss people off, and those who are familiar with libertarianism will,
bring it.
When you say taxation is theft, that's very controversial, because how dare you say that taxation is theft? Taxation gives us roads, which, by the way, roads are mostly funded by consumption taxes, by fuel taxes. So that's not really an argument to tax my income. Schools, we need schools, right? Well, those are funded by property taxes, which I'm not in favor of either, but still not a reason to tax my income.
They're not going so great either.
Right. So the things that your income gets taxed for are Ponzi schemes like Social Security, which to me, it most definitely is a Ponzi scheme. That is selling future generations into slavery for your own benefit. And there's plenty of arguments that people have that it was necessary at the time, but I just don't think that that's a very good argument. Just because you think you needed it at the certain time doesn't mean that it was moral or principled to do. And what happens if you don't pay your taxes? Let's take it to its logical conclusion, because people will tell you that you're being fallacious by saying that taxation is theft, because whoever gets coerced to pay a tax, everyone just pays consensually, right?
Yep.
I think that it is more accurate to say that people favor paying the tax than having someone come and beat down their door and, the IRS SWAT team come and physically remove you.
You don't have another option at the moment.
And you know what happens?
You don't get a choice.
You know what happens to tax evaders? They get physically removed from their home, their family gets destroyed, and all of their property gets taken and liquidated to the state.
Yeah, and to expand on that, in the System is Down forum a while back, I was talking about just that. Like, does the government have the right to forcibly take your money to enforce somebody else's morals that you may or may not agree with, or something that they think is valuable? And there were a lot of people that had never even thought about that idea. So this is kind of the audience that you're talking to.
Okay.
We don't need to get super deep into the hardcore libertarian spats back and forth because, well, I am a libertarian, but this isn't exactly a libertarian podcast yet.
Sure.
Until all you guys listen to this conversation and change your minds, and then we'll get into the deep weeds. But yeah, that's kind of the audience that we're. I'm sure we have a lot of Lines of Liberty podcast people that have come over, and thank you, Mark Claire, for giving shout outs. But the general audience here this is all, I would assume, probably news to them.
Okay.
So
sure.
Proceed.
And I would say to any of those folks that I know that I might sound like I'm kind of being edgy and kind of maybe sound like an asshole or something when I say that, well, you don't have the right to put a gun to my head and force me to pay for certain things. I totally understand it, and I've been there. I mean, it's been a long progression from me being like I was talking about at the beginning, socially liberal, fiscally conservative, to the radical person that I am now. And
sure.
And I just
it's fairly new to me, even.
Sure. And like I said, I don't really want to scare people off or anything, but I mean, this is really what it comes down to for me. Is that I have to take a radical position on property rights. Otherwise, I feel like I'm compromising my worldview in a way, and I try to be as consistent as I can. And if it comes right down to it, I don't even believe in actually Because when you say that you're an anarchist, for example, which I avoid the term, people have this perception
Because you're out smashing windows,
right,
and shopping at Hot Topic, and
yeah, I'm not
starting fires. And stuff.
I'm not Antifa, and I know crazy leftists who are like that because I'm in Minnesota, and I hang around a lot of people in the music world, so I'm certainly around the radical left ideology, and even the milquetoast leftists around here are pretty. Not very sympathetic to my ideology. Let's just put it that way. I don't bring up politics at work because if I were to say taxation is theft at work, I don't think I would have a job the next day.
Sure.
But anyway, for me, it's just about how I live my life. I have taken a vow to not use violence against people who do not use violence against me. I feel like that's the moral and right position to take, and I don't think that that's radical. And it might seem like when I really get into the theory of how social interactions work, probably sounds like I'm radical, but it really just comes down to I'm a big peacenik and I'm a big hippie. I just don't feel like using violence against peaceful people is a legitimate thing to do. So that's really what it is for me. And as far as how I interact with the government, I try to make it as minimal as possible. I don't ask them for anything. I just basically do the bare minimum so that I can not be taken out of house and home. And when it comes to voting, for example, I'm more than happy to vote for certain ballot initiatives that come up. Like let's say there was one on the books tomorrow to legalize all drugs to be. I know I just said I was gonna take it easy on your audience and like, but hey, heroin should be legal. I'm just gonna throw that out there.
Hey, we had a drugs episode. I already gave my thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
They probably line up with yours, so
for sure. So if something were to come up like that, which it won't, especially in Minnesota, it's funny. Here, people like to think that they're all super progressive and things like that. But if you can bring up, oh, we should legalize medical marijuana, but we don't want to make it totally recreational because kids will get a hold of it. And I'll tell you what. I grew up as a stoner.
Like alcohol, right?
I grew up as a stoner. It was a lot easier for me to get a hold of a bag of weed than it was a bottle of liquor. I'm just going to put that out there. Illegal drugs were not hard to get, even in the middle of a cornfield. So,
right, it's not changing anything at all.
And
look at Prohibition. I mean, all it did was make people want alcohol
correct.
more. And the illegalization of weed makes weed cool. It makes kids want weed more. It's not cool if all the adults are allowed to do it.
Sure. Yeah, there is certainly that social component. And I would almost wonder if when Portugal legalized drugs, there was an influx of people using. And I just almost wonder if that's because people were answering honestly on surveys, And I think I would almost wonder if that's the same thing in Colorado too, because they say that the user numbers went up in Colorado.
I'd say that's probably two things. It's probably A, they're willing to admit to it, and B, it might have increased a little bit because they were wanting to give it a shot or whatever, and now they're allowed to say it.
Right.
Like, I've never smoked weed.
Yeah.
And when it's legalized, maybe before. Don't listen to me, CIA or whatever. Maybe before, I'll give it a shot, but the only reason I'm not now is because I obey the stupid laws of the land because I have a family.
Yeah, hey, and I don't blame you. I don't advocate that anybody use drugs. And the only thing I would say is if you are going to, please take precautions and learn about what you're putting in your body. I
definitely
see, and here's where my socially liberal side comes out is that I would rather, if the state. And I know I just said that I'm super radical and everything, but let's say we do have a drug policy and that extorted funds are going to be used to fund some sort of program. I would rather it go towards rehabilitation than incarceration.
Absolutely.
Still, on principle, no, probably don't fund that with taxation, please. But but
if you're going to fund something, don't fund locking people up. Fund helping them.
Right. But I think I have to be intellectually honest to say the lesser of the two evils would be rehabilitation, which is probably not even something I will see anytime soon. You know what's funny? My uncle actually was pardoned by was one of those 100-some people that got pardoned.
Clemency?
Yeah, and if you listen back to that episode that I did with John Odermatt, my dad was in prison too, so it probably sounds like I just have like this really, really terrible family, right? But But actually, I don't know. In some ways, and I hate to bring this up because of just the social lexicon, especially in Minnesota. We have a very social justice thick kind of atmosphere here, especially in the city. And I've said to people before, I'm like, I kind of understand what the black folks are going through in some way, and I have to add that caveat, right?
How dare you, straight white man?
Right. Okay, so I was telling someone that, and I was like, yeah, because I grew up in this community where, members of my family had hard times holding down jobs. Factories are kind of leaving the rural Midwest. I call it a post-industrial age, that the Midwest, and in my opinion, that's kind of why Trump got elected, right? Is there's all this production being emigrated to other places in the world and in the country, and we're having a growth in the technology sector and a shrinking of the manufacturing sector, which is great economically. I'm happy that that's happening, but it does have social consequences, and one of them is people are going to start cooking meth to make money, and that's something that members of my family have done, and I don't think it was a very good choice. I wish they wouldn't have done it, but I guess all I can say is I came up against some pretty bad odds in this world, having come from a family like that and been around things like that. And now my life is pretty great, and I'm economically sound. But of course, when it gets down to people that know me, when I'm talking about this stuff, they say, "Oh, well, I don't think you realize how privileged you are." And that that can piss, yeah, right? That just pisses a person off. And I'll admit to them that in some ways I am treated perhaps better in some situations, but I mean, if you look, I mean, I've got tattoos and stuff. There are prejudices against me, so it's like, I don't know. I just find it to be really silly when people just completely invalidate you by your identity.
Yeah, it's completely invalidating your whole life story. My biggest issue is everybody is a person. They all have a story. They all have an upbringing that they came from. They all have a skin color and a backstory and everything. People are not statistics. They're not, this guy was raised like this and so he turned out like this, or this guy looks this way so he inevitably will be this way. I'm only saying this because of the culture that we're in. I don't want to say like white people have it harder than other people, but white people sometimes do have it harder than other people. In certain situations, it just depends on the situation.
Yeah.
Everybody has a stigma against them for something,
Sure.
And it just depends on their backstory and where they come from.
Right. To build on your point there, what you're talking about, it does probably sound like we're saying poor white people when we talk about this stuff, but there are places where you do have quite a bit less privilege. On paper.
It's poor people.
So in the college structure, for example, what would you rather put on your application if you could lie? Depending on what school it is, you might as well just not be putting in the application if you're going to check white.
Right.
You know? And I know that this is probably sensationalist to put it like that, but there really is a sort of demonization of whiteness just in general. But I would just argue that your identity and your gender, they're the least interesting thing to me when I am getting to know someone.
Yeah.
You know, unless I'm sexually interested in them, then I'm probably going to be a little biased if they're women because I'm heterosexual.
Sure.
You know, like
how dare you?
But as far as like someone's race or anything like that, and I don't know, maybe having been raised in a family where my parents did kind of raise me to be very socially tolerant, which I'm thankful for, because there are people that get raised to be hateful.
Yeah.
Not to say that there weren't. I grew up around people that were very racist and, you know, would say very terrible things about black people. And I was always like, why do you think that way? I just don't get it. So in some ways, I understand this move that the social justice left that's happening right now.
Yeah.
I understand it. But they're trying to flip the power dynamic. They're trying to flip it from.
They're backlashing overboard.
Yeah,
they're not trying to even it out.
Correct.
Which sounds terrible from a white guy, but
yeah. Well, and you can even tell from this conversation that we're having right now that we are walking on eggshells.
Absolutely.
Even talking to, I'm sure people in your audience and the people I'm going to share this with aren't really going to like throw bricks at us, but we're still teetering on the edge here.
Right. The fact that it's a touchy subject for us, like we don't have an opinion because we're white guys.
Right.
I want equal rights for everybody,
Right.
including myself. That's it. The line is where I want this to sit. That's all.
And I would imagine that you would agree with me that we believe in equality in the eyes of the law and not equity of outcome. And I think even good progressives will admit that. As much as I disagree with some of my left-leaning friends who were Bernie supporters, there are a lot of them that I respect as people who are very against this socially thick, the social justice thickness that has been sort of running through our culture. So I just have to say, I know we're talking about a lot of other podcasts on here, but
Go for it.
But
more show notes.
There's a guy named Brett Weinstein who was on Dave Rubin recently, and he was from a college called Everdeen. And I don't want to take too much of his story, but that guy really got screwed, and he's a super lefty, like super progressive guy. He got kicked out of his first college that he went to, when he was a kid and stuff, and because he stood up for some racial injustice of some kind, and now he's being ostracized by his college for putting out an email during this no whites on campus day that they had.
Yep.
So yeah, I would just say anybody who may be listening that maybe think that we're just being fragile white males, just look at what's happening on campuses, and it really isn't a very long stretch from academia to government.
To expand more on that story, just so people know, this was a campus where they traditionally did a black walkout day or a black...
Yeah, it's based off of a play where in this fictional town, they staged like a day where the blacks just didn't show up to work, and just to sort of illustrate a point. And sounds like kind of a beautiful metaphor and a pretty cool story,
Yeah.
And it sounds like a play that I would watch, but then they just flipped the power dynamic in it and forced white people not to come, whereas before it was a voluntary statement.
Well, they didn't force them. They basically said, instead we're going to flip that, and this year we're going to do a no whites day, and the whites come to school, they are against us. And there was this professor who said, I don't think this is the right way to go. That's it. He was saying, I certainly support. He was all for racial equality and everything. He just said, I don't think this is the way to go. I think that this is pushing racial inequality, and I don't support this. I support you guys, but I think what you're doing is a terrible idea. And because of that, he's currently going through struggles with the students calling him a racist, and he's on the verge of being forced out of his position because of that, which should be the complete opposite of what they're trying to do with these statements, you would think.
Yeah, and here's the thing about these folks is they're completely changing language, and this is a Marxist tactic to actually subvert the language that we're speaking with. So the word racist means something completely different now than it actually reads in the dictionary.
Right.
Racism is the belief that your race is superior and you have prejudices and act in a certain way that is going to disparage people of color or people of a different race than you. So when people say racism, when they're talking about a genuine instance of something racial happening, it's usually racial prejudice.
Sure.
Racism is actually a lot more rare than people would like to admit. Some people, at least. That's a very astute thing to recognize when we're seeing these problems come up. And even when we talk about economic issues, I think ACLU recently put out a tweet after it was released that Trump is going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. And ACLU actually said that it is a step back for racial justice to have pulled out of the Paris Accord. And so there's this whole dynamic in the narrative right now. Basically, it's saying if you don't agree with our policies, then you're racist. And I'm almost guilty of not using the word racist right now, but I just have to. Because they don't really see it that way, though. I'm sure that if you're to say, well, that's bullshit, that you can just say, because let's say that climate change is a real thing and the polar ice caps are going to melt 10 years ago, then you're going to admit that probably a good part of coastal California and Florida is just going to be wiped off the map, right?
Yep. Praise God.
So I would like to see the population demographics for that, but I'm going to assume because America is a majority white, that you're actually going to kill a majority more per capita of white people when you trash Florida and California.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, you said good riddance. Maybe we wouldn't have to have an electoral college if that were to happen. Because one would also have to admit that New York would be gone. So, hey, well, all we'd have to worry about is Chicago at that point.
Just kidding. The 2 people in Florida and California that are listening. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
No,
Not you, the other people, your
Yes.
neighbors.
You're smart enough to move because you're listening to this podcast. Mark Claire would be one of those. So
Oh yeah, and Brian.
that's right.
But yeah, so they're changing the entire narrative by changing language in itself. So I think I wish I could remember it off the top of my head, but there's a Lenin quote where he basically says that you have to change language in order to change culture.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what these people are doing. So if you dissent from the 3x5 card of allowable opinion, as Tom Woods would say,
Yep. Man, we're giving all the plugs today.
yeah, what I'm doing is I'm being subversive, quote unquote. Just planting seeds in your viewers' minds to go and listen to some brilliant podcasters.
Absolutely. And I support all of them so far.
Yeah. So what happens is these people in academia are not very far from government, because if you look at the demographics and the professions of people that make up the government, it's mostly lawyers and people who are formerly in academia. I think a good example of this would be Elizabeth Warren, who, if I remember right, is kind of a little bit of both. She's quite possibly the worst careers you would ever want in a politician is someone who is an Ivy League professor and a lawyer. So I mean, these are the people that are running the place. So it's just like the loonies running the asylum, right. That's what it seems like to me. So we really do have to be vigilant in that. And I don't even know what the right answer is going forward. I mean, is it when we have kids, not send them to college and promote them actually taking a skilled trade or something that is going, because if you think about it, college does nothing for you besides prepare you to be, depending on what college you go to. I would say
Sure.
most universities and most like prestigious establishments are going to just prepare you for a non-job, basically, because a lot of the fields that people are getting pushed into from the administrators are careers that actually don't have very good outcomes as far as careers. So it's like they're pushing people into social sciences that there's no jobs there,
They can riot really well.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like super down in the dumps about it, but lately even for me, it's been kind of hard to keep my optimism, which I try to keep, but it's just so hard when you try to make a simple point about, do we really need X social program? Do we really need to rob more people for more money for that thing? And if you look at examples of Sweden is probably the biggest example of social policies, right? And that progressive leftists try to use. Yep. One thing you have to consider when you are comparing Scandinavian countries to America is that a lot of the Scandinavian countries have just voluntarily been that way, and they've organized themselves that way for centuries. I mean, they're small communities. They're very nationalistic. They haven't really had very much immigration because no one wants to go and live in the freezing, Finland or, you know what I mean? Like they're really not very good comparisons. These paradises that people tell us about, like in Sweden, just kind of look at one statistic at a time, and it kind of falls apart little by little. For example, Sweden is one of the places in the world with the highest amount of people on antidepressants.
Right.
So we like to think of that place, oh, it's so great. They've got universal health care, but they've also got this bloated pharmaceutical sector that they have there, which is pseudo-private, pseudo-public. Yeah. And everybody's, they call it the happiest nation on earth. but they're happy because they're feeding these people SSRIs by the truckload. So I don't know.
Everybody's happy when they're on antidepressants. That's kind of the point.
Unless you're young and have this certain liver like deal going on, then you want to kill other people. Well, so this is a great place to get back into conspiracies, right? So, because what I'm thinking of here is there's a big conspiracy among, I'm not sure, I've seen you talk about Alex Jones before. I'm not sure if you're an InfoWars listener.
I was. No,
Sure.
To preface, just so you know, I listened to Alex Jones for like 6 months straight, and I was all about it, and kind of fell off the bandwagon.
Sure.
Honestly, when he started hardcore promoting Donald Trump, I was like, something's fishy.
Yeah, sure.
Something weird's going on here. And I would probably take that in a more conspiratorial direction, and you would probably take that in a more quote-unquote realistic direction. So,
well, okay. Let me start with maybe my thoughts on it first here. I would say that Alex Jones is probably just a desperate person, both emotionally and politically, or as far as like gaining audience. I think he might have saw an opportunity, right? So that's my take on it. Okay, so my libertarian ideas all come down to the non-aggression principle, right? Which to me, that's not like a law, that's a principle. And the way I put it is that is simply just a filter through which you're supposed to interpret a given situation. Does
most
violence
people
need to be
listening
used
to
in a
this
situation?
probably don't know what the non-aggression principle is. So quick breakdown.
Yeah, and I've touched on it just briefly. That basically, what I was talking about with property rights is what it all comes down to in libertarianism, and then claims over property rights. So you want to have a system to arbitrate those rights. Now, what I see the non-aggression principle as, it is simply a pact that we take, and it's our version, the libertarian version of the social contract, more or less, where it's this general social consensus that you just don't use violence against people who are not violating your property and your rights. So we refer to it as the NAP. Now, when it comes to relate this to my thoughts on conspiracies, where I usually defer to Hanlon's razor, it's never attribute to malice which can be adequately explained by stupidity. So basically, to me, a lot of conspiracies sort of you can either break them down into, well, this was an orchestrated event that had to have a maestro that was at the helm and making shit happen. Like I was saying earlier, I was trying to kind of rephrase what I believe, and maybe I'm just a conspiracy realist where I believe that there are obviously people who conspire against other people. 9/11 was a conspiracy. It just depends on who you choose to give the malice to, and if you think that it's this globally orchestrated event that happened, right?
Absolutely.
So someone conspired to hit those towers. Maybe this is like a middle of the road approach, but
an 8-lane highway right up the middle.
where I'm kind of appealing to conspiracy theorists and just the public at large, because this is a realistic thing in my point of view, that we are teamed up with the Saudis in geopolitical, going-ons, and the Saudis somehow, for political gain, orchestrated this attack through their proxy extremist groups and had these people fly planes into our buildings, and we found out about it afterwards and wanted to cover up their tracks because we have a vested interest in helping the Saudis.
Sure.
So that's really as simple as it comes down to for me. And I used to be a 9/11 truther, and I'm really not sure what really struck me. It wasn't like one moment where I was just like, oh, that just doesn't make sense. Like, how did they put thermite in there and all the bombs and the
Building 7.
Yeah, that is still one that I don't really understand. See, so here's where I still kind of appeal to that, is that I don't have an explanation for Building 7, and I've seen debunkings, and they're actually not all that persuasive.
Yeah.
A debunking of chemtrails, that one's pretty easy for me to wrap my head around, and I agree with the scientific consensus that contrails exist, and that's all that it is. But maybe let's not unpack too much. So basically, the way I interpret it is with a lot of conspiracy theories, they come down to this basic idea that this really seemingly small thing is this huge, vast conspiracy. Whereas it seems like in the record of history, if a government wants to kill its people, it just does it. I mean, that's that was just kind of the modus operandi of Leninist Russia, was
like 9/11.
You got me on that one. But yeah, I just don't see governments being very, very quiet, or whatever organization wants to cause a mass extermination. They've never been very quiet about it. They're just very open with their genocide. So I guess maybe it pokes a hole in my logic when I think about the foreign policy that's going on right now, where it is kind of in this sort of coded speak. We're not really trying to kill the Yemenis. It's just this situation where we're just helping the Saudis block food from going there. That's all it is.
Sure.
And so let me get away from bloviating about conspiracies here for a little bit. And since I brought up, go ahead.
I'm curious about your anarcho-capitalist leaning, just for my personal knowledge, and I'm sure a lot of other people's personal knowledge. I mean, we talked a little bit about libertarianism, but like in anarcho-capitalist ideas, ideally, I lean that way too. I'm curious about your thoughts on like the military and its place, if it has a place, or
Sure.
I mean, as far as anarchy, does the government have any role, or?
Sure. So the word anarchy is a little interesting. I suppose I try to stay away from it, other than just the socially awkward use of the word.
Yeah.
But hierarchies exist, and I just think that it's a misnomer to what I actually believe in to call it anarchism.
Yeah.
Because voluntary hierarchies happen like in the workplace. My boss rightly makes more money than me. My boss does a lot more work than me. He knows more than me. I go to my boss when I don't know shit.
Yes.
So, sorry, I didn't know. I don't know if you swear on this podcast. My bad.
We do.
but-
I say whatever, and I edit it all out. It doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so essentially to me, the military is an interesting one. And I actually don't have, a lot of minarchists really dig their heels in on just like basic, like, we just need a military. That's all we need. And I would totally be fine if that's all the federal government did. I would welcome that. I wouldn't have any protest to it. But I would even say in Ancapistan, as it were,
Sure.
That a military force would simply be the same thing as we have now, but the people who hire them are more accountable, and the security contracting firms would actually have to abide by rules and laws that we consider to be just in a court of law. Sure. And of course, this is just speculation. I can't actually say that Blackwater would be held more accountable if we hired them to protect cargo ships from Somali pirates. I don't actually know. But all I can say is right now we have a shadow government that basically works under this.
Ooh, not conspiracy theorist, eh?
Yeah, I see, and this is why I kind of am walking back my saying that I'm a former conspiracy theorist, because there is a sort of untold thing that's happening within the government right now, and especially around foreign policy. We ignore the greater motives of our allies, such as the Saudis. I think that's it's kind of low-hanging fruit, I guess, to people that know anything about anything.
Sure.
About a foreign policy and the like. It's crazy. I mean, you can look up, there's stuff getting declassified right now that is just bonkers. One that came out not too long ago was about, in the 80s, we basically helped Syria when it was a dictator that we liked, just to get them a pipeline going through there. I don't know much about it, but there's a lot of blood money tied in with our foreign policy. If we look at situations like the most recent attack in Syria, alleged sarin gas attack,
Yep.
If we're to think that is a call to action, then why don't we have any calls to action as to the militant groups in the Congo who have an actual rape culture? Right. They actually, the women in the Congo are systematically raped by their military there in the Congo. So, I mean, if we want to talk about human rights abuses, there are places, especially in Africa, in the sort of more tropical parts and southern part of Africa, that they even have Islamic extremism. I'm sure not very many people would know that because why, we're not there. We're not getting attacked by South African Muslim extremists or Islamic extremists. So, yeah, we have very obvious double standards for, we'll trump up these charges against, terrible people. I mean, I'm sure Assad is a terrible guy. I'm sure he does some pretty dirty stuff in his country.
Would you say that's a conspiracy? That we're focusing on one and not the other?
Yeah. I mean, you got me up against the ropes on that. I mean, I guess I am a conspiracy theorist. I just maybe have a higher threshold than a lot of people for what I consider. But yeah, as far as the military goes, to get back to that, I don't see any way that a military would not exist. No matter what, a country with a lot of wealth and a lot of capital is going to have some sort of military defense structure.
Right, for defense.
Right, whether it be multiple security firms that contract out to people in foreign relations. That's definitely going to happen as long as we are a wealthy nation.
Sure.
And I think I would imagine the reason why we centralize all of it is so that we can have a well-funded standing army. Yeah. I think that's probably the reason why that gets justified. And I think it was Bastiat who said something about if you have a standing army, generals are going to want to use it, basically. Right. So basically, we should only be using military force as necessary. And the only system I see that working in is one that is a system that respects property rights and where it is in a market system where resources are only going where they're actually needed instead of being able to just fabricate reasons to use a military.
So would you say that you're more just general libertarian leaning, or would you say that you're anarcho-capitalist leaning? Because anarcho-capitalist is privatized military.
Privatize the nukes.
Yeah. I personally think that our military should be national defense, and that is the max that they should be, really.
And I would applaud that, like I said.
Sure. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that privatized military? I was looking into some anarcho-capitalist stuff today, and they're all about privatizing military and having multiple militaries within the U.S., and they can act in national defense. But in my opinion, if they're privatized, they might be working against each other.
Sure.
Which might mean that you're getting, the best for your local standing, but at some point, without any centralized government or any centralized defense, are you even a country, or are you Illinois and you have your state defense, really?
Sure.
They have their state defense.
Sure. Yeah. And I would just say that on the subject of multiple security firms, I would agree that it seems like a pretty logical standpoint from a market perspective that if you had multiple firms and they were all competing for your business, that they would have to be the best at what they do. And that can sound pretty scary, especially to people that are not privy to the libertarian or anarcho-capitalist mindset. They're going to think, oh, well, that means the organization which kills the best is going to be the best. And I would say that there are still ethical considerations that these firms would have to take. And I would say that the only thing that's going to, because right now we just have a public system, and it's basically the fox guarding the hen house, in that the state just basically comes back to itself and asks, are we in trouble? No? All right, we're good. So it's just kind of a sort of nepotism. And I kind of go back and forth on this. I don't know if it's best in the system that we have right now to actually let the military have more power, because they actually do sort of push back against some of, generals are pretty good a lot of times at pushing back against the edicts that are coming from Washington, of the chicken hawks that are trying to send their boys off to war. To the folks that are in the military that are listening, I'm not so anti-government that I'm going to demonize people that are in the military.
Not at all.
I think they're probably our biggest ally. out there, culturally speaking. They're the people that see violence being used to its fullest extent and probably have a high threshold of what you should legitimately use it for. So I think that they're potentially more predisposed to the message of liberty than practically any other normal person that you might pull off the street.
They at least have the best intentions. Even if they don't know why they're doing what they're doing, they have the best intentions, and I certainly don't demonize them either.
So, and then to get back to your question about whether I'm a libertarian or an anarcho-capitalist, I would just say libertarianism falls under a huge blanket, and that I certainly tend towards anarcho-capitalism because the more and more I learn about history, the more and more I learn about free markets, and the more I learn about government, the less I can justify a state existing. So starting at the top down, I would rather see less power in the federal government and just more power into the hands of local communities.
Sure.
So I know that sounds, that especially to a progressive, really anybody in our culture is going to get a little afraid of that, especially I'm an atheist, so I run around a lot of atheist forums and whatnot.
Sure.
And the first thing when I talk about my political ideology are things like, well, I don't want a Department of Education, for example. I just don't think that there's a legitimate use for a federal Department of Education. The states already take care of their funding for schools. Why should the states have to send their money into the federal government and then have it sent back to them and rationed to them if they're good boys and girls, you know? And when I say that, they're like, oh, well, morally bereft people down in the South are just going to teach their kids creationism. I'm just like, do you think they're not getting that outside of school in the church or something? Like, if you're really that worried about it, you really can't police thought.
Point in case.
Like, you can try.
I was raised super conservative Christian, and I was raised believing in creationism, and the public schools were teaching evolution. You know what my parents did to negate that? They said, hey, your school's teaching that. We don't believe that. That's it. That's all it takes.
Yeah, that was the end of it.
Yes.
Sure.
And vice versa.
I've got my own personal opinions about it, but I'm not going to use violence against your parents just because they believe a certain thing. You know what I mean? Or let's say the neighboring community teaches that in their schools. I just won't send my kids there, you know? Like,
yeah.
And to me, that's where a lot of people kind of go wrong in their moral convictions on how society ought to be run.
I think that people are stupid. Like, kids can't discern things for themselves. In general, or they aren't learning anything from their parents. So if the school's teaching something, the kids are all going to believe that.
I guess what I'm kind of getting at, and just to not to leave religion on a dead end here, even though I said I'm an atheist, I'm really respectful to people's faith, and it's funny, in my own podcast, I avoid politics like the plague because musicians are going to be more comfortable talking about religion than they are going to be talking about politics. And I know that if I start talking about politics with any normal left-leaning progressive musician, it's not going to end very well. And I'm going to create an uncomfortable situation with me and the guest. And I just want to have a good interview. You know what I mean?
Well, my podcast is here to create uncomfortable discussions. So
I'm glad things like that exist.
Absolutely.
But yeah, anyway, it's just sort of weird to me that we can, and I'm not sure if you've noticed this too, where you can openly talk about religion, but politics is just this thing that'll have us at each other's throats, which it's sort of weird. We've sort of flipped that dynamic, whereas before it was like everybody agreed on politics,
right?
You know, and they'd kill each other over whatever faith they believed in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that political stances are almost 100% in the general based off of emotion and morality and the way people feel. So I don't think that they're different topics at all. I think they're pretty much the same. Every Republican running person has to say, I am a Christian, and I believe in God, and I believe in the sanctity of human life, and so people should not have the right to choose whether they abort or not. I mean, it's all just hot button topics. It's all like Christianity. You have to be a Christian to get into the White House, Republican or Democrat, in my opinion.
Right.
Like Barack Obama, he's a Christian. He's our president, so he has to be.
Is that why Gary Johnson lost?
I hope so.
He wasn't a Christian?
I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt. I would love to see an atheist in the White House. Absolutely.
That's kind of funny coming from a pastor's kid.
That was a long time ago. I don't think that whether you're a Christian or you're an atheist, I don't think that your religion should even be discussed, because when you are applying for a job, they're not allowed to ask you what you believe. But
Sure.
when you're applying for the White House job, the most important job, that is one of the most important things that they ask you, and you have to answer it.
And it's a requirement.
I don't give a shit if you're a Christian, a atheist, a Muslim. I don't care. Can you do the job? Can you do the job well? That's it.
And here's how much the blue pill still runs through my veins. I mean, I still, if I were to think that an atheist were vying for president, I would actually get skeptical of that person. You know, like because we've been so conditioned,
right?
Like to think that that's just the morally right thing for a person to be. And you know, I was raised Lutheran, so that's probably just part of me coming out there and just the general cultural consensus about that.
Well, I would get skeptical of an atheist running in the White House just because they are the shake-up candidate now. Like, we had a black president. Then we had Donald Trump, who's the outsider and a
and then
crazy
Hillary
guy
Clinton,
who all of a sudden became Christian right before he got elected. And if there was an atheist running, I would be skeptical of him just because I would assume maybe he's putting that point out there to get votes. I don't care what you believe.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how we got way far away from the military and libertarianism.
I'm really bad at keeping things on topic, if you haven't noticed.
That's all right. That's all right, man. But as far as identifying politically, I often just refer to myself as a libertarian. And sometimes if I really want to be edgy, I'll call myself a voluntarist if I'm not talking to fellow libertarians, because it's easier for me. I know a lot of people just say, oh, fuck labels don't matter, but I think that's just kind of a cop-out in some ways, because labels do have a pretty valid meaning.
Yeah, if you're going to say labels don't matter and then explain all of your beliefs and everything about you, then fine.
Sometimes
don't take a label.
Right. Sometimes it's just more expedient to say, well, I'm this, so if you're going to write me off for this, let's just stop the conversation right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just consider myself under the tent of libertarianism, and I would just say that what libertarianism is, it's like, in its American right, libertarianism is based off of anarcho-capitalism. So to take libertarianism to its greatest possible ends, you would be an anarcho-capitalist, and then anything less than that, you're less libertarian, I would say, like from a purist standpoint. But I'm not going to be language police and say that if you're a classical liberal, I'm not going to let you call yourself a libertarian. I don't really care about it that much. If you don't want to use violence against me, you're probably pretty good in my book, you know?
Yeah. As Jason Stapleton would say, or you stand with liberty, I'll stand with you.
Yeah, and that's why I like Jason. Like, he's a pretty solid message for liberty, and he's like got that Larry Sharp kind of mentality to him where he's all about coalitions and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, cool. Big, long bunch of collective nonsense that hopefully people will have listened to up to this point.
Yeah, I think you'll be able to pick out some good stuff out of all that. So,
no, I love it. And yeah, like I said, seems like the last couple of people I've had on, we just have so much to talk about, and I want to dig into each individual thing. I want to dig into conspiracy stuff with you very hardcore, and I want to dig into libertarian stuff with you more hardcore, even if people listening to the show hate it. And I want to dig into even religion with you more hardcore, being somebody raised Christian.
Yeah.
And
dude. Just hit me up. We'll set something else up. And I just want to say for your listeners there, I am in the System is Down forum. So if you've got any questions about what I'm talking about here, as far as libertarianism and politics, feel free to reach out to me, because I'm a pretty chill guy, and as long as you're not going to like character assassinate me and be a dick, I'll respond to you, and we can hash this stuff out, because I want to have more coalitions with people who have values similar to mine. And I feel like when it comes down to it, I think all of us agree on these core moral principles, and that's kind of the appeal of libertarianism, is it's consistent and simple. The idea that you don't use violence against people who aren't using violence against you is something we learned when we're like 7 years old. You know what I mean? Like, so it's really basic and human, and in some ways I fail to make the emotional connection to it just being a simple moral philosophy, because I bloviate about privatizing nukes and
Yep.
shit like that. So anyway, I would also just like to put a plug out there, if you don't mind, for my own show.
That was the next thing up. Go for it. Anything you want to plug is more than welcome.
Sure. So I run a podcast called Subversion, where I interview musicians just about life and death and their music. And it's mostly Twin Cities musicians from here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. But I have been doing remote interviews with people. And I know you run around with a lot of musicians. So
I do.
If any of your musician friends are listening, hit me up, and I would love to have some more people on, because I'm always fielding new guests. So yeah, check it out. You can find it anywhere that you get podcasts, and you can find it at subversionwebcast.com, and I'm also on Facebook.
Yeah, honestly, a lot of the people that are listening to this are my close friends, and they know that my life before getting into all this crazy nonsense was just music. So
Yeah.
We have a lot of people that would definitely enjoy your podcast. Again, Subversion Podcast. Go check it out for sure. I've listened to a couple episodes, and I really enjoy it personally.
Awesome. Yeah, glad that you like it. And I know that it sounds like you run around with like sort of metal and screamo kind of stuff, which I would love to
I don't run around with anybody. I sit alone and make music on my own.
Well, it sounded from the little tidbits that I heard that that's the style of music that you're not shy making. And I would like to get more hard music on, because I've mostly just been having like singer-songwriters kind of, which is fine. I love all kinds of music. I mean, I'm a music junkie. But
Absolutely, me too.
But I grew up with real hard music, so I would love to get some metal musicians on to chat them up.
Very cool. We've got way too many around here, way more than we need. So
Oh yeah,
I'll send some your way.
hell yeah.
Well, cool, man. Thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and you have a good one, man.
Yep, you too.
Take care. Hey guys, thanks for listening. I really enjoyed chatting with Trey, and I really hope to have him back on soon to dig deeper into some of these topics that we touched on. As he said, he's part of the TSID forum and is more than happy to chat with anyone about his views. So if you want to go challenge Trey to join the forum, just head over to Facebook and type in "The System is Down Forum," or go to tsidpod.com/forum. And when you get there, just hit join and we'll get you right in. So you too can be a part of this uncomfortable nonsense that we have going on here. Also, don't forget to like and follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe and review the show on iTunes so you can help me validate all my poor life choices. Do all of that, and I'll be back here next week with another deliciously discomforting episode for you. Until then, question everything and stay uncomfortable. Thanks. This has been a Goulash Media production. goulashmedia.net.
This concludes our broadcast day. Click.